Twilight fell like a heavy curtain over the dusty frontier town of Willow Bend. Cicadas hummed in the tall grass, and the last rays of sun danced crimson across the winding river. That's when he saw it, an abandoned wicker basket bobbing at the water's edge. Frank Silence. Malley. A gunslinger famed for a stoic presence and lightning-fast draw, almost rode past without stopping. But an eerie cry, soft and urgent, froze him in his saddle. Carefully he approached, heart pounding. Inside lay 3 tiny infants, orphaned triplets, their wails faint yet insistent. In that moment, the reclusive gunslinger made a choice that would change all their lives forever. Frank Silence. Malley didn't earn his nickname by accident. Ever since the tragedy that stole his family years ago, he'd barely spoken more than a handful of words at a time. Folks said he let his 6-shooter do the talking, though he rarely drew unless cornered. Most men in Willow Bend gave him a wide berth. That evening, Silence had been out patrolling the riverbank, a habit he picked up from his days as a reluctant lawman. The ranchers in these parts worried about cattle rustlers, and the county sheriff, Frank's old friend, had asked him to keep an eye out. He had expected to find maybe a stray calf, maybe suspicious boot prints, certainly not an abandoned basket containing 3 tiny swaddled newborns mewling like lost kittens. His eyes went wide beneath the brim of his battered hat. It wasn't a sight one encountered on the frontier. 3 identical babes with wisps of curly hair, their blankets damp from the river's spray. Their cries tugged at something deep in his chest, a memory he'd tried to bury. Slowly, he dismounted and crouched beside them, heart racing. Who would leave triplets here so vulnerable at dusk? No note, no footprints, nothing but the hushed rush of the river and the eerie hush of the approaching night. One of the babies reached out a tiny hand, grabbing at his gloved finger. The infant's grip was surprisingly strong. Silence swallowed his voice, locked behind old grief. He carefully lifted the basket, setting it across his saddle. 3 sets of eyes blinked up at him, looking for comfort he wasn't sure he knew how to give. He stood there for a long moment, unsure. Finally, with a silent nod, he climbed back onto his horse, cradling the basket gently. The last streaks of sun vanished, leaving the land awash in moonlit silver. Slowly, the stoic gunslinger guided his horse toward Willow Bend, 3 newborn lives clinging to him, as if he were their last hope. When Silence rode into Willow Bend that same evening, most shops were closed, and the saloon lights shone like distant stars. A few tired cowhands shuffled about, but no one paid much mind to the gunslinger heading toward the old boarding house on the north side of town. It was run by Lucille Baker, an imposing widow with a heart of gold, one of the few who'd ever shown Silence genuine kindness. He guided his horse to a stop beside the weathered porch. The triplets slept fitfully, their soft whimpers blending with the creak of the wooden steps. Silence took a deep breath, bracing himself. He'd never once asked Lucille for help, never asked anyone for help. But these babies were a special case. Carefully, he lifted the basket and climbed onto the porch. Lucille opened the door almost immediately, lamp in hand. Her sharp eyes widened at the sight, a tough-as-nails gunslinger holding a basket filled with 3 squalling infants. For a heartbeat, words failed her. Then she set the lamp on a nearby table and ushered him inside. "Frank Malley," she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might frighten the children. "Good heavens. Where did you find them?" Silence set the basket on a worn ottoman. One of the babies stirred, letting out a feeble wail. Lucille knelt, gently brushing a lock of curly hair from the child's forehead. Her voice trembled with concern. "They're so cold." The gunslinger swallowed, forcing out the few words he could. "River. Alone. No sign." It was the most anyone in Willow Bend had heard him speak in years. Lucille's face softened, realizing how urgent this situation must be for him to push past his silence. Without hesitation, she lifted one of the infants, tucking the child close to her ample bosom for warmth. "We'll need blankets milk if we can find it. These poor things must be starving." Frank nodded his eyes, flicking between each tiny face, a surge of protectiveness coursing through him. He'd found them, and now they felt like his responsibility. Lucille beckoned him to follow, leading him deeper into the boarding house, where she would summon what comforts she could for the triplets in their unexpected hour of need. By dawn, word had spread like wildfire through Willow Bend. The silent gunslinger had brought 3 orphaned babies into Lucille Baker's place. In a town that thrived on gossip, it was the only topic of conversation. From the livery stable to the general store, folks whispered, traded rumors, and speculated about the identity of the children. All morning, curious townspeople lingered near the boarding house, hoping to catch a glimpse. Some offered baby blankets or old rattles from their attics. Others brought jars of goat's milk or fresh cow's milk from nearby ranches. The triplets, meanwhile, slept in makeshift cradles. 3 wooden drawers lined with soft towels, while Lucille bustled about preparing small feedings and singing lullabies. As for Silence, he found himself on Lucille's front porch, staring into the dusty street. The thought of stepping into public, facing the swirling questions, made him uneasy. Over the years, he'd perfected the art of being invisible in plain sight. Now he was the center of attention, whether he liked it or not. Sheriff Tobias Gray, an old friend who had once tried to recruit Silence as a deputy, arrived by noon, tipping his hat respectfully. "Heard you found some lost little ones," he said gently. "Any idea whose they are?" Silence just shook his head, lips pressed tight. There was no clue to their parentage, no evidence of who might have left them to the river's mercy. The sheriff sighed, removing his hat to scratch at his balding scalp. "I'll wire neighboring towns. Maybe we'll get word if someone's missing triplets. But in the meantime, folks are asking what'll happen to them." At that, a flicker of resolve crossed the gunslinger's eyes. "They'll stay with me," he said in a low, raspy voice. Sheriff Gray looked surprised, no astonished. Silence rarely spoke full sentences, let alone declared such a responsibility. "I can help arrange for them to be placed in a proper home," the sheriff offered. Silence shook his head again. "They're mine. Now," he whispered. No one could quite interpret the swirl of emotion in his tone, but it was final. Sheriff Gray nodded slowly, and with a tip of his hat, wandered off to quell the townsfolk's chattering. Inside, Lucille cooed at one of the babies, gently rocking the infant to sleep. Outside, Silence leaned against the porch post, eyes scanning the horizon, as if daring anyone to challenge his decision. The triplets were orphans, abandoned and vulnerable, but not anymore. They had a guardian now, a man of few words but unyielding resolve, ready to protect them at any cost. The next few days tested Silence's mettle in ways no gunslinger duel ever had. Caring for 3 tiny infants meant sleepless nights, endless feedings, and a constant cycle of changing, soiled swaddling. Even Lucille, who graciously offered her boarding house as a temporary nursery, could only do so much. She had paying tenants to look after, and the triplets' cries made it clear they needed a quieter space. Late one evening, After the third meltdown of the night, Lucille and Frank sat at her kitchen table, sipping weak coffee. The babies finally slumbered in a small adjoining room, exhausted from their own tears. "You might consider building something of your own, or renting a cottage," Lucille suggested gently. "You can't stay cooped up here forever." Frank nodded. He had savings from odd jobs, plus the small inheritance left after his own parents' passing. Enough to buy a modest place on the outskirts of Willow Bend. He'd never needed a home before, content with a single rented room at the saloon or the bunkhouse of whichever ranch hired him. But that life was impossible now. The next morning, he scouted the edges of town and found a run-down cabin near the foothills. It had only 2 rooms and a sagging porch, but it was a sturdy structure. The owner, a traveling peddler, was happy to sell cheap. By day's end, Frank was the cabin's sole occupant. Well, him and 3 babies who needed a warm roof over their heads. Word spread, and to Frank's gratitude, the townsfolk rallied. A few old ranchers showed up, hammers and nails in hand, to fix the porch. Miss Ethel from the Mercantile donated a battered crib with a fresh coat of paint. Even the blacksmith's wife knitted tiny socks. It was as if the entire settlement took an interest in these triplets, and the stoic man determined to raise them. As evening fell on his first night in the new cabin, Frank stood by the single window holding one baby on his chest, while the other 2 dozed in a shared bassinet. The place smelled of new lumber and the faint musk of old dust, but for the first time in ages, silence felt a flicker of belonging. This was more than just a roof. It was a home shaped by kindness and necessity, where 3 little souls might flourish under his silent watch. In the hush of early dawn, soft sunlight streaming through the lone window, Frank Silence Malley carefully balanced one of the babies in his arms, while preparing a bottle for the other 2. He still wasn't sure how to manage triplets single-handedly, but day by day, he learned through trial and error. One lesson: feed them as quickly as possible to avoid a triple screaming chorus. He also realized something else: these children needed names. For days, the townsfolk had simply called them the triplets, but that wouldn't do forever. Yet naming them felt like a heavier responsibility than taking on a gunfight. After all, he had to choose something that would guide their identity for the rest of their lives. That afternoon, he conferred with Lucille and Sheriff Gray around his small wooden table. He pointed to the first infant, the one with a tiny dimple in her left cheek, and whispered Daisy. The name tumbled out softly, surprising even him. He recalled a meadow of daisies from his childhood, a moment of fleeting happiness. The second was the one who always kicked and wriggled, full of spunk, even when swaddled. "She's Rosie," Lucille suggested. Frank nodded in agreement. Something about that feisty nature suited a flower known for its thorns and beauty. The third child, quiet and watchful, seldom cried unless truly hungry or cold. Frank looked into her big, dark eyes and said, "Lily," the memory of a small lily pond near where he grew up drifting through his mind. So it was decided. Daisy, Rosie, and Lily. 3 tiny girls with floral names orphaned by unknown parents, but now tethered to Frank Malley and Willow Bend. It felt right, as if these gentle names would offset the harshness of the frontier they faced. Over the following days, the girls' personalities began to blossom. Daisy cooed sweetly whenever Frank held her. Rosie flailed her little arms like she wanted to punch the world in the nose. And Lily stared at everything with intense curiosity, like a tiny philosopher observing the world. Frank watched them grow with a mixture of awe and trepidation. He was no father figure, or so he believed. Yet each step forward, each night, successfully putting them to bed, each calm morning, feeding chipped away at that doubt. For the first time in a long while, Silence felt his heart stir with something resembling hope. One evening, just as the triplets dozed off, Sheriff Gray paid a visit. He came bearing news that startled Frank to his core. No parents had come forward to claim Daisy, Rosie, and Lily, but rumors suggested a roving outlaw band had been near the river around the same time he found the infants. Some said a young woman with them had died under mysterious circumstances. Sheriff Gray shifted uneasily on Frank's porch. If that rumor's true, the baby's mother might have been one of the gang's hostages, or maybe the outlaw's own companion. Regardless, we need to tread carefully. If there's any chance these outlaws discover the children are still alive, they might come calling. Frank's jaw clenched. The idea of these triplets connected even tangentially to a ruthless band of outlaws put ice in his veins. He'd faced criminals before, even killed a few in self-defense, but never while caring for 3 helpless little ones. "What do we do?" he managed to ask. Sheriff Gray tipped his hat back. "We keep watch, that's all. My deputies and I will do our best to track this band. You be on guard. If they come near Willow Bend, we'll know." When the sheriff left, Frank stared at the sleeping triplets, a wave of protectiveness surging in him. He remembered how swiftly tragedy could tear a family apart. Years ago, his own wife had died in a stagecoach robbery, leaving him broken. He'd never wanted to love anyone again, for fear of losing them. Now he had 3 new reasons to fight. Late that night, as he tried to rest, nightmares plagued him. The roar of gunfire, the sight of Lily, Daisy, and Rosie snatched away by faceless men. He woke in a cold sweat, trembling in the darkness. The babies were safe for now, their quiet breathing reassuring. But the faint threat of an outlaw gang cast a long shadow over their little cabin. At dawn, Frank strapped on his gun belt with renewed determination. He might have once been known as the Silent Gunslinger, a solitary figure drifting from one dusty town to the next. But now he had a family, 3 fragile lives that depended on him. If the outlaws did come, they would find a man far from silent about defending the precious new bonds he'd forged. Frank Malley wasn't a talker, but every moment spent with Daisy, Rosie, and Lily nudged him closer to rediscovering the voice he'd buried under grief. Each day brought small milestones. The triplets began to recognize him smiling or kicking their tiny feet when he appeared. That intangible trust they placed in him stirred his soul. Word spread that Frank had chosen to keep the triplets permanently, though no formal adoption process existed out here in the wild frontier. He visited the local church, speaking with the elderly Reverend Porter about baptisms and records. The Reverend was delighted by the idea of welcoming the 3 orphans into the community, offering blessings and prayers for their future. During these errands, Frank carried at least 2 babies in his arms, while the 3rd rode in a sling across his chest, often leading to amusing scenes in town. Women at the mercantile fussed over him, offering unsolicited advice on feeding schedules and teething remedies. Ranch hands teased him half in jest about how he'd become a family man. Amidst the fuss, Frank maintained his calm, reticent demeanor. But inside, he felt a flicker of gratitude for these neighbors who seemed to embrace the triplets as well. Even the rowdy saloon crowd softened at the sight of Lily, Daisy, and Rosie. For a man who'd always been alone, it was surprising to realize how the children's presence melted barriers in others and in himself. Yet danger still loomed. Occasionally he caught glimpses of suspicious riders at the far edges of Willow Bend, watching from a distance. Sometimes at dusk, a shadow would dart across the street, disappearing around a corner. Sheriff Gray insisted it was likely just travelers, but Frank's instincts, honed by years of near-silent vigilance, warned him otherwise. Nevertheless, each night, as the triplets dozed in their 3 wooden cribs lined up along his bedroom wall, he felt an unspoken bond surge. He was their protector father in all but blood. The responsibility was immense, but so was the unexpected warmth it brought. If anything threatened these children, he would stand in the breach ready to break his vow of silence with a thunder of gunfire, if necessary. The tension in Willow Bend ratcheted up when a band of rough-looking strangers galloped into town one windy afternoon. They bore no identifying marks, yet their predatory eyes and heavily armed presence set everyone on edge. Sheriff Gray and his deputies kept a close watch, but the strangers rented rooms at the saloon's inn without causing an immediate ruckus. Still, rumors flew. Some folks muttered that these men might be the same outlaws connected to the triplets. Frank, hearing about the newcomers, felt his stomach knot. He returned to his cabin early that evening, barricading the door and windows. The triplets, sensing his unease, became fussy and restless. Daisy refused her bottle. Rosie cried inconsolably, and Lily stared at him with wide, fearful eyes. In a rare surge of frustration, Frank paced the room. How could he keep them safe if an entire gang was scouring for them? The memory of losing his wife gnawed at him, stoking an anger that had long lain dormant. He vowed not to repeat that tragedy. At midnight, a knock at his door shattered the silence. Heart-pounding, he checked to ensure the triplets were secure before inching toward the entrance. "Who's there?" he rasped, voice taut. "It's me." Gray came, the sheriff's hushed reply. Frank unbolted the door, letting the lawman slip inside. Gray's face was grim sweat beading along his temples. "We have reason to believe those strangers are indeed part of the outlaw gang. They were overheard asking about 3 babies found by the river. They're suspecting you might be harboring them." Frank felt an ice-cold wave wash over him. "They planning to strike?" Gray nodded. "Likely. My deputies and I can stand guard, but we're not enough to hold off a full crew if they want blood. I think it'd be wise for you and the girls to leave town for a bit. Maybe stay at a bigger ranch with more hands or somewhere we can set up a real defense." Frank's jaw clenched. He'd never been one to run from a fight, but the triplets changed the equation. "We'll move at dawn," he whispered. The sheriff clapped his shoulder. "I'll get some men to help. We won't let harm come to them, Frank. Count on it." As Gray departed, Frank gazed at the sleeping triplets, each face a testament to innocence. By sunrise, they'd flee to safety. But a storm of gunmetal and vengeance was brewing on the horizon, and Frank Malley braced himself for the coming war. With dawn's first glow, a small entourage gathered behind Frank's cabin. Sheriff Gray had recruited 3 ranch hands, sturdy fellows, armed with rifles, to accompany Frank and the triplets. The plan was to travel to the sprawling Buckley Ranch, several miles north, where tall fences, numerous hired guns and watchtowers offered more security. The triplets, bundled in thick blankets, whimpered softly. They sensed the tension in the air, the hurried hush of adult voices. Frank gently placed them in a sturdy wooden crate, lined with cushions, then hoisted it onto a wagon driven by one of the ranch hands. He rode alongside on his horse, scanning the horizon for any sign of the outlaw gang. As the wagon creaked out of Willow Bend, curious townsfolk peeked from windows and storefronts. Some waved in support, while others wore anxious frowns, understanding the threat that shadowed this departure. Lucille Baker stood by her boarding house door, hands clasped in prayer, tears shimmering in her eyes. The journey proceeded uneventfully for the first couple of miles, winding through sagebrush plains under a pale sky. Sheriff Gray and his deputies rode at intervals, their watchful gazes sweeping each ridge. The ranch hands guarding the wagon looked jumpy but determined. But halfway to the Buckley Ranch, the calm broke. A rifle shot rang out from a nearby cluster of boulders, whizzing past the wagon's canvas top. Instantly, the group kicked into action. Gray and his men returned fire, taking cover behind a shallow embankment. Another shot echoed ricocheting off a rock near Frank's horse. Heart pounding, Frank spurred his mount forward, maneuvering close to the wagon. The triplets were crying now, their panicked wails slicing through the dust-laden air. He risked a quick glance inside. The girls were unharmed but terrified. The outlaws emerged from the rocks, outnumbering the posse 2 to 1. Through the gun smoke, Frank spotted their leader, grim-faced eyes burning with murderous intent. Sheriff Gray signaled a retreat to higher ground, hoping to outflank the attackers. Frank clenched his jaw, unsnapping the cover of his holster. He'd do whatever it took to protect those children. As the firefight escalated, adrenaline surged through him. He remembered every tragedy that shaped him, every reason he once withdrew from the world. Now he faced a new reason to stand and fight 3 small hearts whose entire existence rested in his hands. This was a confrontation he could not avoid. And if it came to a test of skill, the outlaws would learn just why he'd been called Silence, a man whose gun spoke volumes when words failed. Amid the chaos, rifle shots thundered across the plains, kicking up clouds of dust and rattling the wagon's wheels. Sheriff Gray managed to position his men behind a low ridge, allowing them to exchange fire with the outlaws. Frank remained close to the wagon, scanning for any bandits attempting to sneak around. Rosie's cries mingled with the sharp crack of gunfire. He heard Daisy and Lily wailing too, their frantic sobs twisting a knife in his heart. He had to end this quickly, or get them away before the outlaws closed in. With steely calm, Frank dismounted, tethering his horse to the wagon. He signaled to a ranch hand to keep the triplets' crate low in the wagon bed. In a fluid motion, he drew his revolver and advanced, hugging the line of scrub brush for cover. The unstoppable fury he once buried now fueled every step. He crept around the enemy's flank, listening for the telltale shuffle of boots on gravel. Catching movement in his peripheral vision, he whirled and fired, dropping a bandit who had taken aim at Gray's men. Another outlaw rose, leveling a shotgun at Frank. Silence's reflexes flared. He dove sideways, pulling the trigger mid-roll. The shotgun blast scattered wide, and the outlaw crumpled with a grunt. Sheriff Gray and his men seized the opening, pressing forward. The outlaws, seeing 3 of their number down, wavered. One yelled a curse, retreating toward the boulders. Another raised his hands, slowly backing away. The firefight was brutal but brief. Within minutes, the remaining outlaws fled, dragging their wounded behind them. Frank stood, panting revolver smoking in his hand. The wide plains fell eerily silent, except for the rustle of wind and the muffled sobbing of the babies. Adrenaline pulsed through him, overshadowing the sting of a bullet graze on his arm. Sheriff Gray approached, face grim. "We'll chase 'em off for good," he said, ordering 2 deputies to follow the trail. "You get those little ones to the Buckley Ranch. We'll secure the path." Frank nodded, reholstering his gun. His gaze drifted to the wagon, where Daisy, Rosie, and Lily still wailed in terror. The sight nearly shattered him, small forms trembling in a world grown too violent. As the dust settled, he cradled each baby, murmuring quiet reassurances that belied his usual silence. They had survived the battle, but he knew this likely wouldn't be the last confrontation. The outlaws, or Whoever commanded them would stop at nothing if these children posed a threat or an asset to their plans. A new wave of determination hardened in Frank's chest. He would never let them fall into the hands of men who valued life so cheaply. By nightfall, Frank, the triplets, and the remaining posse arrived at Buckley Ranch. The sprawling property boasted sturdy fences, tall watchtowers, and enough hired guns to rival a small militia. Lanterns gleamed in the ranch yard as the group entered their wagon, rumbling over packed earth. Martha Buckley, a formidable woman with iron-grey hair, and the ranch's matriarch greeted them at the main house. She had set up a large guest room, stocked with cots, warm blankets, and plenty of supplies for the infants. "I heard you had little ones to protect," she said gently, ushering them inside. "We'll see that no harm touches them here." After the day's firefight, the triplets were too exhausted to cry. They clung to Frank's coat, wide-eyed. Gently, Martha guided him to a rocking chair near the fireplace, encouraging him to cradle the babies in his arms. The flicker of flames cast comforting shadows on the walls. Sheriff Gray and Martha conferred in hushed tones, while ranch hands patrolled outside. Everyone understood that the outlaw gang might attempt a raid. Here, though the advantage lay with the defenders, the Buckleys had nearly 20 men, all loyal and well-armed, plus the ranch's fortified layout. Frank swallowed hard, the tension of the day slowly dissipating. He felt the sting of the bullet graze on his arm, but the deeper ache resided in his soul. Daisy, Rosie, and Lily needed stability and calm, not a constant cycle of violence. He began to question whether remaining in Willow Bend was truly best for them. Then again, if they ran away entirely, would they spend their lives fleeing? Martha approached, offering him a mug of hot tea. "Stay as long as you need," she said kindly. "The children look worn thin, and so do you." Frank nodded in silent gratitude. She was right. He was exhausted physically and emotionally. The triplets needed rest, and so did he. For the moment, the Buckley Ranch offered a sanctuary he could rely on. But in the back of his mind, he wondered how long that peace could last. The outlaws had retreated, but an army's worth of determination might not deter them forever. And if some greater force was pulling the strings, the final showdown was still looming. Nonetheless, as the flickering firelight played across Daisy's sleeping face, Frank felt a gentle hope stir. He cradled all three girls close, letting their soft, synchronized breaths calm his frayed nerves. Whatever fate demanded, he'd be ready. During the following week at Buckley Ranch, Sheriff Gray led a search party into the hills, hoping to track down the outlaws or discover any information linking them to the triplets' mysterious origins. Meanwhile, Frank settled into a cautious routine on the ranch. He helped mend fences by day and fed, burped, and soothed the triplets by night. Martha Buckley and her ranch hands marveled at the children. Daisy's eyes sparkled. Rosie's feisty spirit never waned. And Lily observed everything with quiet curiosity. The triplets were warm and well-fed, their cheeks filling out with healthy pink. As Frank rocked them to sleep each evening, he felt a surge of pride that surprised him like a father's heart beating in his chest. But the question of who left them by the river gnawed at him. He dreaded the possibility that an outlaw might lay claim to them, or that the baby's mother had been killed and left them behind. He hoped for a better explanation, though none seemed likely. One afternoon, a deputy returned with news they'd discovered an abandoned camp in a canyon bearing evidence that an infant had been there. Tiny footprints, scraps of cloth. The trail ended at a rock slide, blocking further exploration. No conclusive proof, but a strong suggestion the outlaws had traveled with a woman recently delivered of triplets. Sheriff Gray pressed a hand to Frank's shoulder. "If these outlaws are the ones who left the basket, they might be the girl's kin. Hard as that is to stomach. But they abandoned them in a basket by a river, hardly an act of love." Frank's jaw set. He exhaled, struggling for composure. If the outlaws had any paternal or familial claim, did that matter more than the fact they had nearly killed the triplets by deserting them? Gray read the turmoil on Frank's face. "We won't let them near those babies," he vowed. "But we must be vigilant. This isn't over until the outlaws are caught or driven far away." As the sun dipped behind the ranch's corral, Frank gazed at Daisy, Rosie, and Lily, cooing on a blanket near the stable door. Their innocence lit the gloom of his past regrets. He knelt beside them, gently patting Rosie's belly as she kicked with delight. He realized that whatever legal or moral complexities lay ahead, he would fight tooth and nail to ensure these girls stayed safe, because sometimes family isn't bound by blood, but by the unwavering choice to stand together against the darkest of storms. At Buckley Ranch, the tension of waiting took its toll. Though the property was well guarded, each day felt like an unspoken countdown to another conflict. Frank grew restless. He'd always believed in confronting threats directly, not hiding behind walls. Yet the triplets relied on him. One reckless act could cost them everything. Over supper one evening, Martha Buckley joined Frank at the table while the triplets napped nearby, lulled by the gentle hum of ranch life. She spoke plainly. "I see the worry in your eyes, Frank. You're torn between protecting them and facing those outlaws head-on." Frank nodded, his throat constricted, but he forced out words. "I can't keep running or cowering. If I stand my ground, they might come in full force. The Buckley Ranch could become a battleground. People could get hurt." Martha frowned thoughtfully. "We've faced rustlers and marauders before. The men are prepared, but I understand your concern. Perhaps we should lure them into a trap instead. Let them believe they have the advantage while the sheriff and we ranchers wait in ambush." He considered the idea. A trap would be risky. Outlaws were no fools, especially if their leadership was cunning. But it also promised a final resolution. No more skulking in the shadows, no more fear of a midnight raid. Martha sipped her tea, continuing. "Alternatively, you could send the girls away to a safer territory, maybe a distant relative or orphanage in a bigger city. That might spare them from harm." At that suggestion, Frank's stomach knotted. The thought of giving up the triplets even temporarily made him physically ill. He shook his head. "They stay with me," he said quietly, unwavering. "I won't abandon them to strangers." Martha smiled in understanding. "Then maybe we fight. Sheriff Gray likely has his own plan. Let's talk to him." A spark of resolution flared in Frank's chest. He would do anything to shield Daisy, Rosie, and Lily. If that meant a cunning trap or a pitched battle, so be it. He'd once been a mere drifter, a silent gunslinger with nothing to lose. Now he had everything to lose, and that realization fueled a fierce determination. That night he checked on the triplets in their snug corner of the ranch house. With each passing day, he grew surer, no matter how many outlaws lurked, no matter the cost, he wouldn't rest until the threat was crushed underfoot. The next day, Sheriff Gray rode in dust, swirling around his horse's hooves. He brought fresh intel. A known outlaw named Jasper Colt had been spotted near Willow Bend, bragging about lost property that needed reclaiming. Gray believed Colt might be the leader of the group that had attacked them. If they used Colt's greed as bait, they could lure him to Buckley Ranch or an agreed location ensuring a decisive showdown. Martha Buckley gathered her ranch foreman and men, mapping out vantage points along the property. The plan staged a rumor that Frank and the triplets were returning to Willow Bend. Colt would likely intercept them on the main route. Meanwhile, a large force of ranchers, deputies, and volunteer townsfolk would lie in wait along the canyon pass known as Shadow Gulch. At first, Frank balked at using the babies as bait, but they assured him Daisy, Rosie, and Lily would remain safely behind the lines guarded by half the militia. He only needed to ride out with an empty covered wagon, creating the illusion the triplets were inside. Once Colt and his men ambushed him, the hidden defenders would spring the trap. It was a high-stakes gamble fraught with potential for disaster. Yet Frank saw no other path. As long as Colt roamed free, the threat remained like a rattlesnake in the grass. So he agreed, steeling his heart for the confrontation. That night, as he fed the triplets, their last bottle each, baby stared up at him with bright, trusting eyes. Daisy latched onto his finger, squealing in delight, oblivious to the coming danger. Rosie grabbed the edge of her blanket with surprising strength, as if practicing for a future brawl. Lily gazed calmly, as though understanding more than she let on. Frank's chest ached with both love and anxiety. They were the reason he would risk everything. Putting them at even perceived risk tore him apart. But better a single battle now than a lifetime of running. Outside the ranch, men practiced with rifles, the clank of metal echoing under starlight. Tomorrow they would set the trap in Shadow Gulch. Frank prayed silently that they would succeed quickly, and that this final stand would bring the quiet life he dreamed of for his 3 miraculous daughters. Just before dawn, Frank and a small escort rode out from Buckley Ranch with a covered wagon trailing behind. Inside the wagon lay blankets shaped to mimic sleeping infants. Sheriff Gray, Martha Buckley, and a formidable force of men took a hidden path circling to positions along the jagged walls of Shadow Gulch. The canyon was narrow with steep cliffs on both sides, ideal for an ambush, though equally dangerous if the outlaws suspected a trap. Frank's heart hammered as he guided the wagon into the gulch, morning light, casting long shadows across the dusty path. He tried to appear casual, glancing back occasionally, as if worried about his precious cargo. They didn't wait long. A shrill whistle cut the air, and a band of riders stormed in from the canyon's mouth. Among them, a tall man with a scar over his right eye. Likely Jasper Colt barked orders. "Stop right there, hand over those brats, Mally, and we might let you live." Frank drew the horses to a halt, playing the frightened caretaker. "Leave us be," he growled, making sure his voice carried. Colt merely sneered, dismounting with a menacing swagger. The tension crackled like lightning. Then, with a subtle flick of his fingers, Frank signaled to the watchers above. Gunfire erupted from the canyon rims. Ranch hands and deputies popped up behind rocks, unleashing a barrage of bullets that pinned the outlaws in place. Chaos ensued. The outlaws scrambled for cover, returning fire. Colt roared in fury, firing shots at anything that moved. Dust swirled as horses reared, men yelled, and the canyon reverberated with echoes of battle. Caught in the crossfire, Frank ducked behind the wagon, revolver in hand. This was no time for half measures. He aimed carefully, picking off an outlaw, creeping toward a vantage point. Another tried to circle the wagon. Frank's bullet clipped him before he could close in. Sheriff Gray's voice boomed from overhead. "Surrender, Colt, or we'll bury you here." Colt spat curses, firing wildly. At that moment, Martha Buckley emerged from a side ledge, rifle in hand, her shot grazing Colt's shoulder. With a guttural snarl, the outlaw leader stumbled, dropping his gun. Within minutes, the outlaws, battered and outnumbered, threw down their weapons. Some tried to flee but were chased down by swift-riding deputies. Colt collapsed, wincing, as Gray and Martha pinned him under their rifles. The canyon fell silent, except for the ragged breathing of men. Frank stood heart-pounding, gazing at the victorious scene. The trap had sprung perfectly. He exhaled a long breath of relief. One question remained. Would this truly sever the outlaws' connection to the Orphaned Triplets? Forever time would tell, but for now the confrontation ended, with Colt in irons, his men subdued. Frank silently thanked every lucky star that no innocents were harmed, and that the decoy wagon was indeed empty. With Jasper Colt and his gang shackled and hauled off by Sheriff Gray's deputies, a long-held breath seemed to release from the heart of Willow Bend. The outlaws' threats had cast shadows for weeks, dark clouds lingering just above the rooftops. But now, with justice finally delivered, the sky felt bigger, brighter. Peace wasn't just hoped for. It was finally real. Frank silence. Malley stood on the front porch of Buckley Ranch, his hat in one hand, watching the posse disappear into the dust-choked road, heading east toward the territorial jail. Beside him, the triplets stirred softly in the morning air, bundled in thick shawls Martha Buckley had sewn herself. The past weeks had changed everything, not just for him, but for this entire town. Inside the Buckley home, Martha set a kettle on the stove, her movements purposeful. "You planning to head back soon?" she asked gently, as Frank stepped inside, holding Lily in one arm and a bag of supplies in the other. Frank gave a short nod. Cabin's quiet now. Safe again. It's time. Martha's gaze softened. "You're not the same man who showed up here a month ago. You came with eyes like a locked door. Now," she smiled, "now you look like someone who's been handed a key." Frank didn't answer, but his silence said enough. Daisy babbled in his other arm, and Rosie tugged at the hem of his shirt, determined to climb him like a tree. He crouched low, letting her grab onto his shoulders, her tiny giggles echoing like music through the ranch house. That afternoon they packed the wagon again, this time without haste, without fear. Lucille Baker had written to say the cabin repairs were finished. Several townsfolk had chipped in. The blacksmith mended hinges, and Hinges the schoolteacher painted the shutters, and one rancher even left behind a rocking chair, carved with small flowers for the girls. As Frank hoisted the girls into the wagon, wrapping them in thick quilts and placing their favorite toys nearby, Martha placed a hand on his arm. "You have a home here, Frank. Any time. And those girls, they've got more family in Willow Bend than they'll ever know." He gave her a rare smile, small but genuine. Then, with a tip of his hat and a grateful glance, he took the reins and turned toward the road leading home. The journey back to Willow Bend was quiet, the trail now familiar. Along the way, the triplets took turns pointing at trees, animals, and clouds. Lily hummed to herself. Rosie tried to climb the side of the wagon, and Daisy, ever the dreamer, watched butterflies drift alongside them. As they entered town, the reception was nothing short of heartwarming. People lined the street, not as a formality, but out of affection. Children waved, adults brought small welcome-home gifts. One boy handed Frank a carved wooden rattle shaped like a horse. Another woman presented a jar of strawberry preserves for the girls' first proper breakfast back. Lucille was the first to greet them, arms outstretched, as if she could gather all three girls at once. "Welcome home," she whispered. "It's over. You did it." Frank dismounted and helped the girls out one by one. They were home, truly home. Later that evening, as dusk painted the sky in strokes of lavender and gold, Frank sat on the porch of the repaired cabin. The girls played in the new fenced yard, toddling clumsily after a striped cat that had decided to adopt them. The world was quiet, in the best way. No gunfire, no pursuit, just the low murmur of cicadas and the distant bark of a dog. Frank leaned back in the new rocking chair, a mug of coffee in hand. The vow of silence he once wore like armor had been replaced not by chatter, but by presence. Steady, watchful, warm. In his heart, he knew the fight wasn't just for survival anymore. It was for something deeper, for roots, for peace, for tomorrow. And as the stars blinked awake above the Wyoming plains, Frank Malley closed his eyes and smiled. The new day had dawned, and it belonged to them. The sun crested the horizon as Frank Malley guided the wagon back into Willow Bend, the reins steady in his calloused hands. Behind him, 3 tiny voices babbled in rising excitement, their joy unburdened by the dangers they had narrowly escaped. It had been weeks since the dust settled at Shadow Gulch, but the memory of that ambush still flickered in Frank's mind like embers refusing to die. And yet today felt like a new beginning. As the wagon rolled into town, people stepped out of storefronts and homes, drawn by the rhythmic creak of wooden wheels and the curious soft squeals of children. What once might have been wary stares directed at the silent gunslinger were now replaced with smiles and warm greetings. Ranchers tipped their hats, mothers waved dish towels from porches. A few children even ran alongside the wagon, trying to get a glimpse of the 3 most famous babies in the territory. Lucille Baker, eyes misting, hurried out of her boarding house with her apron still on. She didn't hesitate. "Give me that baby, Frank," she ordered, playfully reaching into the wagon to scoop up a giggling Daisy. The little girl recognized her instantly and reached up to tug at Lucille's earring with glee. Frank simply nodded, lips twitching at the corners in a hint of a smile. It wasn't the hero's welcome he'd ever imagined, but it was one he felt in his bones. Not because he craved recognition, but because it meant the triplets were safe. Truly safe. Over the coming weeks, Frank got to work restoring the small cabin that had once been just a stopover in his wandering life. The bullet holes in the doorframe were patched with fresh pine. New shutters framed the windows. Sheriff Gray and a few ranch hands helped erect a small fenced yard, perfect for when the girls began walking. And walk they did. Rosie first, predictably harrowing across the room like a tumbleweed with legs. Daisy followed soon after, clapping her hands as she went. Lily, ever thoughtful, took her time. When she finally stood up and walked to Frank with deliberate steps, he felt something inside him shift again. She had his measured calm, his observant silence. The triplets' personalities unfolded like wildflowers in spring. Daisy laughed at the birds and tried to catch the wind with her chubby hands. Rosie developed a habit of challenging everything. Blankets, spoons, even Frank's boots. Lily preferred to sit in the window, staring at the sky as if trying to read secrets written in the clouds. Frank adapted more than anyone expected. He learned to cook more than stew to distinguish a hungry cry from a tired one, and to sing softly when the girls were restless at night. His voice, long buried, had returned not for saloon talk or shootouts, but for bedtime lullabies and morning greetings. Sometimes, while rocking one of the girls to sleep, he caught himself whispering stories, fragments of his past he'd never spoken aloud to anyone. And somehow it helped heal him too. Lucille stopped by, often dropping off preserves and warm bread, never overstaying but always keeping a maternal eye on all four of them. Sheriff Gray visited weekly sometimes, just to sit on the porch with Frank in comfortable silence. The town no longer feared the gunslinger. They looked up to him. The outlaw threat faded like distant thunder. Colt and his men were imprisoned. No new danger rose to take their place, and the air in Willow Bend seemed lighter. One golden evening as the sky blushed with dusk, Frank sat on his porch with all three girls nestled close. He watched them gaze at the fireflies, dancing just beyond the fence, their wide eyes full of wonder. He wrapped an arm around them, pulling them in close. "They saved me," he whispered. Not to anyone in particular. Just the wind, just the stars. And as the crickets chirped and peace settled around them like a warm quilt, Frank Malley, once a man of silence, sorrow and solitude, felt the unshakable truth in his chest. Tomorrow would come, and it would be theirs. Together. That's the story of how 3 orphaned triplets, found trembling in a basket by a lonely riverbank, helped a silent gunslinger discover hope and purpose again. Through the dust and danger of the frontier, Frank Silence Malley fought off ruthless outlaws, faced the darkness of his past, and forged an unbreakable bond with Daisy, Rosie, and Lily. They taught him that family can arise from unlikely encounters, and that even the hardest hearts can soften when innocence needs protection. If you've been moved by this stirring Wild West drama, filled with gunfire, redemption, and the tenderest of new beginnings, please show your support. Give this video a thumbs up, share it with friends who love frontier tales, and subscribe to our channel for more epic stories of resilience and devotion. Every like, share, and subscription keeps these tales of courage alive, reminding us all that hope can bloom in the harshest deserts. Thank you for riding along.